You know, what if the official story we hear isn't the whole story? Today, we're going to break down a really provocative geopolitical analysis that makes some, well, pretty stunning claims about the U.S. and Venezuela. We're going to use these slides to map out the logic behind a narrative that challenges just about everything you might have heard.
So, right off the bat, the analysis we're examining kicks off with a pretty startling claim, right? It's framed as a future news report, talking about a direct U.S. war on Venezuela and the capture of its president. This is the explosive core of the entire argument. And now, we're about to unpack how the source even tries to justify.
Okay, so how on earth does a report get from here to there on a claim that big? Well, it's not random. The source actually constructs a very detailed case that's built on history, economics, and geopolitics. So let's follow their trail of breadcrumbs.
Here's our roadmap for how we're going to break this down. We'll start with the historical framework they use. Then we'll get into the alleged economic and geopolitical motives. We're also going to look at how the source challenges the official narratives. And finally, explore why this perspective is presented as being so incredibly important.
First up, history. The source's entire argument really hinges on one specific idea, that a 200-year-old American policy isn't just a thing of the past, but is actually being actively used today. So, to really get this argument, we have to understand the Monroe Doctrine. Back in 1823, it was a pretty clear message to Europe: stay out of the Western Hemisphere. But the source argues that over time, it kind of morphed from a shield against outside interference into, well, a sword for U.S. intervention.
This timeline here shows how the source connects the dots. They draw a straight line from that original 1823 doctrine to the 1904 Roosevelt corollary, which basically asserted a U.S. right to intervene. Then, the analysis takes a huge leap forward, claiming there's a modern Trump corollary from a 2025 strategy document that's all about pushing out rivals like China.
And this quote is presented as Exhibit A, the direct evidence of that policy. The keywords to focus on here are preeminent and winding down adversarial influence. According to this analysis, this isn't just talk, it's the ideological justification for controlling the entire hemisphere's resources and infrastructure.
All right, so with that historical context in place, the report then shifts gears to what it claims are the main motivations: plain and simple, economics and resources. It argues that underneath all the geopolitical language, there's a pretty straightforward desire for material gain and control.
And it all starts with one single powerful number. According to the report, Venezuela is sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves. This fact is positioned as the single biggest economic driver behind the alleged U.S. policy. It's presented as this huge strategic prize.
But it's not just about the oil. The source lays out this whole multi-pronged economic strategy they believe is at play: reverse the nationalization of industries, exploit all this other mineral wealth, build a regional supply chain that locks out competitors, especially China, and all the while open the door for U.S. corporations to come in.
And as evidence for this privatization push, the report points directly to this quote, which they attribute to opposition leader Maria Corina Machado. It's framed as a wide-open invitation to foreign capital, a $1.7 trillion opportunity. The analysis uses this to argue that these economic ambitions are not secret at all. They're right out in the open.
Now, beyond just pure economics, the source argues that the situation in Venezuela is a key battleground in a new global competition. It frames the alleged U.S. actions as part of a much bigger strategy to reassert dominance and push back against rival powers.
A huge piece of this geopolitical puzzle, according to the report, is China's growing economic muscle in South America. From a U.S. strategic perspective, a chart that looks like this represents a major threat, and reversing this trend is framed as a top priority.
And this isn't about just one rival. The report portrays this as a multi-front campaign to push back against China, to counter Russian and Iranian influence, to dismantle regional alliances that operate outside of U.S. control, and ultimately, to defend the supremacy of the U.S. dollar itself.
So, if the source is claiming the real motives are all about resources and geopolitics, how does it explain the official reasons we hear for U.S. policy? Well, this next section dives right into the report's deconstruction of that public narrative. And here, the analysis presents a really stark contrast. On one side, you have the publicly stated U.S. goals that we hear about: fighting drug trafficking, promoting democracy, and protecting human rights. And on the other side, you have the report's interpretation that these are all just pretext, a smokescreen designed to mask the true colonial and economic ambitions.
So, to try and dismantle that drug trafficking justification, the report presents several counterpoints. It alleges the main cartel was basically a U.S. invention. It cites UN data that minimizes Venezuela's role, and it even highlights a former U.S. official who seemed to downplay the threat.
And the source drives its point home with this really powerful analogy. By comparing the narco-trafficking claims to the WMD justification for the Iraq War, it's arguing that this is a familiar playbook, creating a false pretext to justify a war of aggression for resources and geopolitical gain.
Okay, so we have walked through the report's historical, economic, and political arguments. Now we're going to zoom out and look at why the source material presents this entire analysis as being so critically important on a global scale.
So let's just quickly recap the core argument we've unpacked here. The report starts with the claim of an undeclared war. It justifies this by pointing to a revived Monroe Doctrine. It alleges the real motives are economic and geopolitical, focused on resources and pushing back on China. And finally, it dismisses all the official U.S. justifications as a propaganda smokescreen.
And this is the ultimate takeaway from the source's perspective. This isn't just about Venezuela. The report concludes that this alleged policy is a fundamental challenge to the core principles of international law and national sovereignty. They present it as a direct confrontation with an emerging multipolar world where the U.S. is no longer the sole unchallenged power.
The analysis we've explored today is one controversial narrative, for sure, but it leaves us with a really critical question that applies way beyond Venezuela. In this high-stakes game of global power, how are these stories built to justify action? And maybe more importantly, who profits from the version you choose to believe?